Good afternoon. I know a lot of you are involved in eating, but we do run these programs right on time, so continue eating and enjoy yourselves. And we'll move right along. My name is Peter Rollins, and along with our Chancellor, Father Monin, and our Executive Vice President, Pat Keating, and our Senior Vice President, Jim McIntyre, I'd like to welcome you to the Chief Executives Club of Boston. Once again, a who's who has gathered. So for you first-time attendees, what we do is go around the room, and this meeting, we're going to tell a little bit about what we did this summer. I would like to recognize our former Senate President, Tom Birmingham. Tom? Our articulate and ambitious State Secretary of Economic Development, Ranch Kimball. Ranch? And our extremely busy and highly respected, and we're thrilled she's here, Lieutenant Governor Kerry Healy. How many times do you hear this region's need for business leadership? And what you hear is, what we need is another Dick Hill. Well, guess who's here? Former Bank Boston CEO Richard Hill. Richard. We have two new guys in town. Canada's Consul General, Neil LeBlanc. Neil. And CBS 4's recently named president, Ed Piet. Ed. And I would also like to recognize the iconic chairman of Fidelity Investments and our favorite multi-billionaire, Ned Johnson. We love having the media here. Today, I'd like to give a special welcome to Marianne Kane, who will be doing another on-the-road taping of her highly respected New England cable news show, CEO Corner, which will air Monday evening at 8:30. Did I get that right? Marianne Kane. There are 14 additional companies who have joined with us since we last met. Apt Associates, Accounting Management Solutions, Boston Celtics, Gap International, Grid2Com, Horwitz and Company, Aneri, Callis Capital, Mass Medical Malpractice, I don't know about that one, Mass Pro, just kidding, that's a joke, Seaport Companies, TD Bank North, Unidyne Corporation, and Vanguard Managed Solutions. Welcome to the Chief Executives Club of Boston. For you non-members here, I would join today. We are going to have a waiting list. And so, as our members know, you want to get on the ball and join in. There are brochures as you depart in the foyer. And for those of you who wish to mark your calendars, we will next gather on October 24th, when EMC's chairman, Joe Tucci, will be hosting Quest's CEO, Richard Notabart. And on November 30th, Patriots owner Bob Kraft will be hosting ExxonMobil's CEO, Rex Tillerson. Other confirmed speakers include New York Times CEO Janet Robinson. Sorry, Pat, but she's coming. MGM's Harry Sloan. Bristol Myers Squibb's CEO, whoever that might be. I don't know if you... and AT&T's Ed Whitaker. And finally, let me thank a man who could become the Commonwealth's first gentleman. Let me thank him for hosting today's event and invite him to the podium to introduce our keynote speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, Sean Healy.
Thank you, Peter, for that kind introduction. Carrie, it's nice to see you. I appreciate the opportunity to welcome Bob Greifeld, the President and CEO of NASDAQ stock market. NASDAQ pioneered the electronic trading model over 35 years ago, but the exchange has changed dramatically in the past 3.5 years since Bob joined as CEO. Under his leadership, NASDAQ has become one of the most innovative and fast-growing exchanges in the world, now lists more than 3,200 companies from 37 countries. As CEO, Bob has focused NASDAQ on its mission of providing the most efficient and transparent trading platform for investors. Through a series of acquisitions since he joined, Bob has substantially enhanced the trading abilities and cost efficiency of the NASDAQ platform. He's also created an innovative dual listing program, whereby for the first time, NYSE-listed companies can also list on NASDAQ. In February 2005, Bob led NASDAQ in completing a secondary stock offering and listing on its own exchange. NASDAQ has subsequently completed 2 more follow-on offerings, and earlier this year, NASDAQ substantially enhanced its global presence through the purchase of a strategic stake in the London Stock Exchange. Bob has been a vocal advocate for modernizing market structure and increasing public company CEO and board attention on the performance and quality of stock markets for the benefit of investors. Bob is an active speaker on financial market structure and regulatory issues. He has been vocal in Washington regarding enhancements to Sarbanes-Oxley for small companies and the use of stock options as a tool for business and economic growth. Bob was well prepared for his leadership post at NASDAQ. Prior to joining NASDAQ, he was a senior executive at SunGard Data Systems. And in a foreshadowing of his future role, Bob, I understand that you actually wrote your NYU Business School thesis on the operations of NASDAQ. The transparency and efficiency of our capital markets is critical to our economic future. And obviously, the financial services sector is a major driver of our own regional economy. As the leader of NASDAQ, Bob is playing a large role in helping to shape the financial markets of the 21st century. I'm sure that we're all very interested in hearing what he has to say. So without further introduction, I'd ask you all to give a very warm welcome to Bob Greifeld.
Thank you, Sean, for that very gracious introduction. And thank you, Peter, for the opportunity for being here today, truly in front of a group of distinguished corporate, government, and financial leaders. It's my great pleasure to be here in Boston. I do have to first admit that I am a lifelong Yankee fan. And before you get too mad at me, you have to also recognize I'm a Jet fan, and they're playing New England this weekend, so you will quickly have your revenge, right? But the Jets did win one game. As the head of NASDAQ, I have the opportunity to spend significant time in Boston. One, we have some very large investors here. I informed Ned that I, like a lot of people, work for him, in that his organization owns about 7% of the NASDAQ stock market. And in addition to that, here at NASDAQ, we have 59, here in Boston, we have 59 companies listed on the NASDAQ stock market with a combined market capitalization over $92 billion. And among these companies, we have several that qualify for the NASDAQ 100. They are led by Staples, Genzyme, Biogen, American Power Conversion, and Akamai Technologies. We also have an annual event here in Boston for all our listed companies at the Boston Pops, and it's truly one of the highlights of our year. In addition, in early 2006, NASDAQ completed the acquisition of a company called Shareholder.com, which is headquartered here in Maynard, Massachusetts. With respect to my talk here today, I will say I'm most interested in receiving questions from yourself, and I will keep my remarks hopefully short, focused, and very interesting. Now, when we think about the capital markets, we realize that most corporate leaders don't spend a whole lot of time thinking or worrying about how the capital markets function. Their interest level is primarily focused on the price of their stock, right? And the business leaders who are not yet public think of capital markets first and foremost as the day that they can access the public capital markets through an IPO. We, of course, at NASDAQ expect that IPO to come to NASDAQ. Now, we here at NASDAQ are also keenly aware of the very significant differences between our capital market structure and our competition in differing structures. Today, I will not address NASDAQ's advantages. What I will do is focus on some dramatic changes that are taking place in the global capital markets. The first, though, two brief points about NASDAQ. As Sean mentioned, we were formed 35 years ago. When NASDAQ started, every single market on the planet had a physical trading floor. We were the very first market that was purely electronic. We do not have a trading floor today, and nor have we ever had a trading floor. Now, the world has followed our lead, and that really hit home to me in the summer of 2005, the opportunity to go to Vienna on vacation. And I was driving down the street with my dad and my son, and we're in a cab, and the cab driver had no clue who I was, but he, in just random conversation, said, to the left there is the Vienna Stock Exchange. And the cab driver said to me, you have to realize, though, that they went electronic about 3 years ago, and the computers are outside the city, and it's a conference center today. So when we have cab drivers in Vienna recognizing that the world has gone electronic, truly the path that NASDAQ has created has been a very valuable path for the capital market system. The second thing about NASDAQ I'll bring up is, as again Sean mentioned, we are publicly traded. We went public on our own market in the beginning of 2005, and we had the proud honor of being recognized by the Wall Street Journal as the #1 performing stock in the entire country for calendar year 2005. Some people might smell a little insider trading there or something, but it was purely the result of us executing our value proposition and investors recognizing it. Now, when we are a public company, I think it's important because we are responsible for establishing the listing standards for 3,200 companies. So we understand the environment that they operate in. We understand the rigors of SOX compliance. We understand the burden of investor relations. We understand the burden of quarterly reporting. And that wisdom can certainly be reflected back in our actions as we run the market. Now, as I said, the global capital markets have entered a new phase. And you could state that this new phase started when we made an acquisition of 25.3% of the London Stock Exchange earlier this year. Now, we're obviously constrained with respect to what we can say about London, but we will make the general statement that there is a coming consolidation, global consolidation of capital markets. And what I've said publicly is this coming consolidation will in fact be a marathon and not a sprint. It's certainly our intention at NASDAQ to leverage our technology, our management, our customer relations to ensure that NASDAQ is the preeminent global equity marketplace. But I think a very good question for this audience is, why now? Why is global consolidation going to happen now? You have an exchange such as the London Stock Exchange, which is over 300 years old. So again, why now? So the first point I'll make is that exchanges on a global basis over the last 5 years or so have gone through first a process of demutualization, where they all started as being owned by the member broker-dealers. So as they demutualize, their view of the world changes. Then as they adopt a for-profit status, the view of the world changes. And as you demutualize and adopt a for-profit status, then you bring in a different type of an employee, a different type of manager who has come to run this for-profit and in many cases public enterprise. When that happens, you really then become a global viable sector, the exchange sector. and that is just happening in the last several years. The other aspect you have to consider, as the world has followed NASDAQ's lead in becoming electronic, you have the ability to recognize synergies between electronic markets. If you have one floor-based market looking to do a consolidation play with another floor-based market, there's very little synergy benefit that you can derive. But clearly, a computer system that does electronic order matching has the ability to consolidate down, and those of us in the technology game understand very clearly that the marginal cost of processing a transaction approaches zero. So we have drivers where these exchanges have become for-profit. We have drivers where they have become electronic. And most importantly, the customers and the stakeholders and the market participants are also global. When we think about our customers, our listed companies, if I think about Cisco, I see that they truly are a global company. They have customers spread around the world, and they have major operations throughout the world. If we think about Staples here, we think about the NASDAQ 100 companies in the Boston area. They really should have an investor base that in a very real sense mirrors their global footprint. And if you look at the investor bases today, that is not the situation. And part of it has been that exchanges, markets have been, in fact, localized, and the investor base then gets to be localized. And you see that many markets have adopted the name of their local city. So when you think about the fact that the markets have been localized, that has represented two hindrances for investors. The first is that for a retail investor, you really do not have an effective access to international marketplaces today. And you see the retail participation outside the home market is incredibly low. Now, if you are a sophisticated professional manager, money manager, then you in fact have the ability to access markets in London and Frankfurt and Tokyo. But the cost of access of an international market is on the order of 10 to 20 times higher than what it would cost you to operate in the domestic marketplace. So clearly, we have not seen globalization's benefit come to the exchange space. So that's a driving aspect to it. And that's what's happening now. That's why it will happen. I say it's a marathon, not a sprint, because in spite of the fact you have these compelling reasons for doing it, that you can in fact enable investors, or you can make investors get a more efficient trading environment. You can better service your listed companies. You can better service the broker-dealer participants who are now global in nature. You still run into regulatory issues that will slow the progress, and we see that in the transactions that have applied. Because as we go to globalization of markets, we're not anticipating globalization of regulation. So we have home market regulation that wants to be home market regulation. And in my time, I don't expect that to change in a meaningful way. Probably in our children's time, we will get to a situation where we can look at regulation on a more global basis. But the fact that globalization will have nationalistic play to it will certainly make this a marathon, not a sprint. Now, when we talk about the fact that we do not have global regulation and we have different regulatory standards, we clearly have opportunities for regulatory arbitrage. And to me, it's a question, do we have a race to the bottom, or do we have a reasoned race to the top with respect to regulation? Now, as everybody here is keenly aware, the U.S. has shifted its balance with respect to regulation in the post-Enron, post-WorldCom environment. And we've implemented such rules as Sarbanes-Oxley. Did anybody ever hear that before? So we are living through that part of it, and it has had an impact on our capital markets and its attraction on a global basis. I would just say for this audience here that the impact is not nearly as great as you might read about in the press. We were very proud to have 20 Chinese companies come to the NASDAQ stock market last year, and this year we see that our international IPOs have raised $6 billion here in the States on the NASDAQ market compared to 4.2 in totality for last year, led by a Russian media company called CTC, which came to the States. So things are moving along, but clearly the SOX regulation and the litigation risk is not a positive for us. But on a global basis and on a more macro basis, I tie back to what kind of dynamic do we want to have with respect to regulation? We're setting the predicate that there will always be different regulatory regimes, but how do you have the proper dynamic? And one of the unintended consequences of Sarbanes-Oxley is that we see a global race to the bottom with respect to regulatory standards. And you have exchanges on the planet saying, I have less regulation than the US, and then the next exchange says, well, I have less regulation to them. And I won't use names here, but we do see that race to the bottom. So many people saw it quite curious earlier this year when NASDAQ came out with what was known as the Global Select Marketplace. And the Global Select Marketplace represents our highest listing tier, and we proudly proclaim that we have the highest set of regulatory requirements of any exchange on the planet. And we said we put this out there as an aspiration for our listed companies to go to, but we also set it out there to try to change the dynamic and try to say that really, when you think about regulation, if we as the business leaders do not take it seriously, then we will be forced to have the government will be forced to intervene. If you think about a race to the bottom, which each and every marketplace is trying to introduce less regulation, there is a bad ending to that story. And the bad ending then results in the government getting involved with the ruling with a blunt instrument, and we get something such as Sarbanes-Oxley. So it's our goal here at NASDAQ to put out what I'll call an open source blueprint for regulation, saying here is what we think is the best standard of regulation for our market. It's meant to be aspirational, but it's meant to really take into account the reasoned input from the business community, something that people can aspire to and not take on unnecessary burden. We throw that out there as an open source blueprint for other markets, other regulatory regimes to try to improve upon it and create the internal dynamic as opposed to a Sarbanes-Oxley type dynamic. So we feel very good about it. We put it out there, again, not as a competitive advantage, but we put it out there as a capital market advantage on a global basis. And we're happy to see that's in fact working. It's very interesting, of the 1,200 companies that qualified for Global Select, within a month of the announcement of that, over 20% of them had of their own volition sent out press releases trumpeting the fact that they were in fact meeting the higher standards. So that is the dynamic that we're looking to create. Now, within the capital market system, what is not working? There's one part of it that is clearly not working, and that is the research function. We have now about 35% of listed companies with two or fewer research analysts. Now the question is, why is that happening? What is the context? First, let's understand that the markets have gotten more electronic, more efficient, led by NASDAQ's event 35 years ago. So as the markets have become more electronic, then you have buy-side participants. And I understand there are a number of buy-side folks in the audience here, and certainly the city is loaded with buy-side participants. And these buy-side participants say, well, this market's electronic. I have technology. I've pioneered the use of technology. Let me access this marketplace directly myself, what's known as direct market access, DMA. And that has forced the sell side to unbundle, their value proposition to the buy side, where you have a discrete cost for market access, you have a cost for research, you have a cost for IPO allocation. And what happened when the execution part of it was unbundled, it obviously then collapsed. The commission capture rate used to be something approaching 6 cents per share. Now it could be as low as a penny. So that dynamic of the electronics making the market more efficient, the buy side wanting to get involved with it directly, has certainly deflated the rate. Now research has been maybe the unintended victim of that, because research never had its direct funding source. It was part of that bundled commission rate. So as the commission rate has declined, the amount of research coverage has declined by a similar amount, because obviously the sell side doesn't have the motivation as their revenue has deflated. So we certainly have an issue here where we have public companies that are not, again, being coverage and information dissemination is a key part of the value proposition of being a public company. Now, what we at NASDAQ have done is launched an independent research network. And again, we are out there for others to try to do something like it and or better. We're more interested in creating a category. We're more interested in making sure the capital markets work very well and very efficiently. So our particular model is the Independent Research Network. We're in a partnership with Reuters. And what we do is allow listed companies to pay for research directly. Now, pay-for research has been available, but it's never had really the credibility. So we put our good brand name and the Reuters good brand name behind it, and we assure that this research will be, in fact, independent, and the companies that are, in fact, paying for it have no control over the selection of the research analyst or certainly the research report. And we maintain a joint venture where it has a network of independent research providers. The companies pay into it, and Reuters provides the aggregation technology and the distribution. So if a research is written, we know it will be instantaneously available on the Reuters network, and it's an open access platform, so it would be available to Bloomberg, to Thomson, to anybody else who wants to see it. And we've just started that. We have, at this point, I think 4 customers on it, and we've just started our research reporting. And again, it's an important part of the capital markets environment, and certainly this part is broken, and we need to see more than just NASDAQ Reuters trying to solve it. We need to see it coming from different parts of the community. And that being said, it's necessary we move forward on it, but I think it's important to recognize that we stand here today 5 years and 1 day since certainly the markets and the world experienced some of its darkest days. In that intervening time, really against all odds, our markets have become more competitive. They have become more efficient. I think NASDAQ is incredibly proud of the role that we play, and this role truly is in supporting the best, the most liquid, the most efficient capital markets on the planet. And I appreciate, again, the opportunity to be here today, and I do look forward to taking questions. So thank you.
Many of the people in this room sit on boards, and maybe you can make a comment on governance. Do you think the governance issues or the way companies handle them are differently for NASDAQ companies, which tend to be faster growing and newer than traditional exchange companies? And do you think being on an electronic exchange at all changes the way you think about and handle governance issues?
Right. One, at NASDAQ, we're proud of the fact that 28% of our market comes from technology companies, but it's 28, it's not 88. So we are represented across basically every industry code that's there. Our governance standards are, by and large, similar to the other exchanges that increased after Enron and WorldCom, where we collectively got together with the SEC and harmonized them. So there are some differences. Ours tends to be tighter in a number of places, and I'll give you a real-life example today. NASDAQ has a hard and fast rule that if you're late with your filings, we start a delisting process, and New York does not. And we've been to the SEC and said either have New York come to our standard, or we'll have to lower to theirs, which we think is the wrong thing, because certainly the cornerstone of making an investment in a public company is to have financial reports. It's hard to make an informed decision after that. So I think, those are some notable examples, but by and large, they're the same. With respect to electronic market versus floor-based market, the regulatory effort of the trading is entirely different, but it doesn't reflect back in the boardroom side. They're really it's a bifurcated environment. Yeah, that's a great question. For those who didn't hear it, the question is, has the London AIM market, I think, really made us rethink how we fund smaller companies? And, we pay close attention to the London AIM market, and and others like it. We don't essentially see that as competition to NASDAQ. In a real sense, the equivalent structure in the U.S. is what's known as the over-the-counter bulletin board structure. The AIM market is not a market with listing standards that companies have to apply to, and you really don't know essentially what you're getting. And there's been a number of stories that just, I think yesterday, a couple companies again had somewhat of a treacherous situation. So I think there's a place for the AIM market, but it has to be clearly communicated to investors what it is and what it is not. And we essentially see that as a feeder system into the NASDAQ market at this point in time.
Do you think that hedge funds should be subjected to additional disclosure or other forms of regulation?
That's a good question. My comment on the hedge fund is that I think that the acid test for being eligible to invest in a hedge fund probably needs to be relooked at because obviously the dollars that were established a while ago are not probably representative of the barrier to entry for the average person that was originally intended. So to the extent that that barrier is at the proper place and the proper informed investors are of their own free will investing in it, and they're doing that in a transparent manner, then I think we should let the free market work.
Do you think that state regulation should be preempted?
In securities regulation?
Yes.
That's a good question. And I should tie back to the first question. Whatever I said does not disagree in any way with the SEC. We have an interesting set of circumstances. I think that the positive side of state regulations, another look, another bite at the apple. I would say this: the security market is incredibly complex, and it's very difficult for, I think, the SEC of their own accord to stay up with the complex and rapidly changing dynamics that exist in the markets today. And I think that challenge is increased, many, many times over for a local state to try to step into those shoes. So that's probably. I was going to say that's probably as far as I'll go with that, and hopefully you can construe what the answer is. It's just very tough. I mean, you really, when you deal with the SEC and you see what they have to, when you have firms as represented by Sean and Ned here, they've got bright, creative minds who are just engineering these wonderful different investment vehicles, and it's just hard for the SEC. I mean, one of our issues is really keeping them educated because at the end of the day, they have to regulate, and it's just impossible to build that knowledge base across 50 states.
Stage left. Hi. Do you think at all that SOX will be modified at all specifically for middle market companies to give them a little relief that those in this room may feel they need?
Great question. I'm glad you brought it up. It was in my notes. I must have missed it. I've made a prediction that we will have Sarbanes-Oxley reform in 2007. I wanted to be the first out there with the prediction, and hopefully I'm proven right. I'd tell you the reason I say that is that, one, when you go down to Washington, it's one of the few items today that gets broad support on both sides of the aisle for Sarbanes-Oxley reform and or relief. And that, as you folks know, is quite unusual. Secondarily, I think the commissioners are of the mindset that something needs to happen. I think there's wide acknowledgement that the impact of Sarbanes-Oxley on smaller companies is a lot larger than for larger companies. Our studies show it's about 10 times as a percent of revenue, the cost of compliance with Sarbanes-Oxley for small companies versus large. The commission had an opportunity to change Sarbanes-Oxley just for smaller companies. I think the feeling was they'd rather try to fix it themselves. So I just predict it will happen. We have two main issues with Sarbanes-Oxley. One is the impact on smaller companies, and the second is there's not a risk-adjusted way of looking at the world. So I think the commission recognizes that, and I'm optimistic. I mean, one of the proposals out there is that the PCAOB will hold the accounting firms accountable for the efficiency of their audit in addition to the effectiveness. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but I do think that changes the dynamics in a major way. And then a concept of being that if you have met the SOX criteria for a given year, then you obviously can get a relief where you don't have to do the audit of that compliance every year. And then a different concept of materiality of what actually has to go through SOX and the auditing of SOX. So we'll see. Hopefully 2007. And I'm sure you folks are aware that, you know, Senator Sarbanes and Representative Oxley are retiring, so it does create the environment to, you know, move it along there in practical terms.
What are the advantages of a company listing on NASDAQ as opposed to the New York Stock Exchange?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one I'd love to answer too. I'm glad I planted it. I would say this. One is, what is our job? You know, our job is to make sure that our market is as efficient as it possibly can. We operate in a zero-sum game. But that, I mean, if our market is less efficient, intermediaries take a bigger slice of the pie and investors get a lower return, right? So it could lead you to say a knee-jerk reaction is to knock intermediaries out of the market and let's just investors meet. Natural, what was known as a natural. And then it's your cheapest and best execution. But in fact, intermediaries play a role because, you know, Microsoft, there's always a willing buyer and seller. You don't need intermediaries that often, but as you go down the average daily trading volume, the need for continuous liquidity increases. So we have to make sure that our intermediaries are playing the proper role at the proper time and place. And we understand that our intermediaries really will be cut from the same cloth as those on the New York Stock Exchange. It'll just be the type of person who goes into that line of work. And I like to say, you know, we have, you know, sharks and they have a shark, and that's the difference in that we commission our intermediaries to compete against each other. We put the sharks in the shark tank to compete against each other before they have the ability to interact with a customer order flow. Our competitor has chosen to anoint the intermediary as a specialist monopolist, where he or she is the only person who has the ability to see all the particular order flow in a particular stock at any time, and that person has the ability to be both agent and principal, and you don't know when or how they're operating. So we think we need intermediaries. We got to constrain them to where they need to be. We think the value of competition will make that happen. Now, how does that show up? And one of our challenges is articulating the value, added value of our market structure. Because what happens is we'll trade more efficiently 2/10 of 1 cent per share. And it's hard for a sitting CEO to jump up and down and say, God, you saved me a cent, 1/10 of 1%. But when you're trading as many shares as people at the table here in this room and in this city trade, it lands up into be, you know, tens and tens of millions of dollars. So it matters, and our challenge is to articulate what that means. And yeah, we're having some fun doing it. Go ahead, Kathy.
Since you're taking all the tough questions, I thought I might ask you about stock options.
I thought you'd give us an easy one then. No.
A lot of the companies that list on NASDAQ are very big users of stock options as compensation. How are you looking at the current issues associated with how stock options have been valued by companies?
Valued, or we'll start with the backdating. We might as well cut. Yeah. So, well, backdating is just plain wrong, and those who are guilty should be punished. But we have to make sure we're again not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So it's a bad practice. It has to be punished. My personal feeling is that options have been just a wonderful incentive tool and have done a lot of great things, for the economy and for this country. And I find it interesting that restricted stock is now the flavor of the month. And to me, restricted stock is giving, guaranteed to give somebody something where he or she might not have done anything. So what I mean there is if you get an option at $10 a share and your stock doesn't go anywhere, then the option expires worthless and you don't have anything. If you give them a restricted stock at $10, if the stock goes down to $8, they got $8. So I just find it curious, and I think the publicity and time will swing back to a more balanced view of restricted stock versus options. And my comment is, there's obviously been a lot of bad practices with it. Options were constructed in a bad way, but it's still an effective tool. So from NASDAQ, we think of performance-based options do not have quick vesting periods. You have to be there for a period of time to get it, and you actually have to do something, and we're not paying for pulse. And I think if you implement it well, you can do it. Okay? Thank you.